Before I start, let me warn you, do not get a job as an undertaker. It's a decent job and the pay isn't terrible, but it isn't really worth the nightmares. It's not worth the nights where you see nothing but darkness and the effigy of cold white hands strangling you and leading you to your death. Now before we begin, you must know that my story isn't a peculiar one. In fact, in terms of sorrows suffered by undertakers, it's pretty mild. When I told some of my buddies about it, they laughed and just told me they've seen worse, and I believed them. It all started when Professor John McQueen died. He was one of the biggest defenders of Satanism that I'd ever seen in my life. In fact, he'd made sure that his children were bound by law to inscribe the words, "and he was a proud believer in Satan," on his casket. Why ever would anyone want to do that? Many said that it was because he was proud of what he was. Some said that it was a joke. One last huge cultural shock to the world and a family of Catholics and devout Christians. Even worse, he ensured that his family arranged his last service in a church. That's right, John McQueen wanted a priest to preach and pray over his dead body while he was in a casket that had a satanic inscription on it. It was all a bit macabre, but since it was all in John McQueen's will, it was done. What could they do? Nothing, really. Now the late professor asked that his burial site be at least 20 miles away from the church where his funeral service was to be held, and that the service was to start at 6 p.m. sharp. His lawyers were all there to make sure that the service and the specifics were just as John McQueen would have wanted it. But when we got to the cemetery where John was buried, it was almost dark. By the time we'd finished and John was in his grave, it was about 9 p.m. Now, I've been an undertaker for quite some time, so I can tell you that the cemetery is pretty much the same at night as it is at day. There are no ghosts, no killers, no skeletons dancing in the shadows, nothing like that. I was the last to leave, but when I got into my car, I remembered that I'd forgotten my wristwatch at the graveside. I was not one to forget things, so this came as a shock to me. Well, what was I to do? I came out of the car and began the long walk back to the grave. And that's when I heard it. The thumping sound of someone digging. I first ignored it as a figment of an overactive imagination, but I was sure I was right. Someone was digging something, or something was digging out. I wanted to break into a jog, but my legs were stiff from fear. And that's when I started hearing the humming. It was low, but since the cemetery was silent, you could hear it. Just as I went down the slope to where John was buried, I saw people in masks running away. I heard of grave robbers before, but I'd never actually seen a case of one. This was something for the police, I figured, and I dialed 911. Unfortunately, I had no reception. At this point, I just wanted to get to the grave, pick up my watch, and see whether these people actually planned on robbing a grave. Of course, I was scared, but I was also an undertaker. I feared a lot of things, and cemeteries were not one of them. I finally got to the side of John's grave, and the almost unthinkable had happened. His grave was dug, but thankfully, it didn't seem like the diggers had gotten very far. I picked up my watch and had one last look into the grave. It seemed they had just begun to scratch the surface of John's casket when they ran away. But something didn't look the same to me. I got into the grave and could feel that I was standing directly on the casket. I cleaned off the dirt from the top part, and to my surprise, written perfectly were the words, "Hes non hic sed surrexit." I could see no trace of the former text. Before I could leave the grave, I felt something crash against the back of my head as I fell into the grave. I woke up the next morning in my bed. I was still in my suit. Disoriented, I googled what "hes non hic sed surrexit" could possibly mean. Apparently it meant "he's not here, he's risen," in Latin. Let's just say I was a bit terrified of cemeteries after that. As a teenager, graveyards used to be my thing. I think one of the reasons why I was so obsessed with graveyards is because I was in my rebellious phase, and there was probably nothing as rebellious as visiting a graveyard just to hang out. In fact, I visited the graveyard so much that I started to have chats with dead people. Well, not actual dead people, but their headstones. I knew their names, their families, and sometimes even their profession. I knew how long they'd lived for, and I made up conversations based on this. I did this for a long while, till one day I decided to visit at night. I was on my way back from a party that I'd left early, and the cemetery was just on my way home. It was a spontaneous decision. I should probably add I was pretty drunk too. So I entered the cemetery and went to the most secluded grave there. It was under a dead willow tree that was thin and had only a few leaves left. The branches of the tree hung low over the grave, and the headstone was covered with dry leaves. At that point, I felt an increasing urge to be the most disrespectful I could be. I decided that I would pee on the grave. What's the worst that could happen? Nothing, right? As I unzipped and made to release urine on the grave, the most remarkable thing happened. There was a huge wind, and one of the branches of the tree whipped across my face. As I staggered to the ground, I could feel the cut on my face. It was pretty deep, and I was bleeding. "Hey, you there! Stop!" was what I heard next, and I took off running. Now, this graveyard was pretty old, and a large one. It was about 8 hectares, I think, and it was quite easy to get lost in. In my drunken frenzy, I discovered that I was in an even more strange area. The headstones I saw were far older than I'd ever seen. In fact, I didn't think I'd seen these headstones in all my time visiting the grave during the day. At that moment, the moon left the back of the cloud and shone brightly on the graveyard. As I stopped to rest and breathe properly, I saw the man. He was short, almost like a dwarf. He was old and holding a staff or a stick, I don't really know. I'd never seen him before, and by this time my fear was leaving the bounds of rationality. It was one thing to be scared of a guard, and another to be scared of a possible gnome, or whatever that was. Just as I was about leaving, the short man started pursuing me. He was very fast for someone his height, and before I knew what was happening, I was in the race of my life. My knees hurt, my breath was labored, and still he ran after me, leading me to the parts of the cemetery I'd never seen. I couldn't find my way anymore, and I tripped and fell into a ditch. It was when I was in the ditch that I figured that it wasn't really a ditch, but a grave. I was in a freshly dug grave. The dwarf thing walked over to me and smiled menacingly over the grave I was in. He got into a burst of cackling laughter that drove daggers of shiver and fear into my heart. Slowly, I watched him unzip, and he peed all over me. Once he was done, he left. I was able to get home that day, but ever since then, I've been having nightmares. It was the last time I ever visited a cemetery. Most scary cemetery stories happen at night, you know. The ghosts, skeletons, and all the other stuff. They're usually out at night. That's what popular culture, Hollywood, and the movies would have us believe anyway. But generally speaking, I'm a night man. After working as a night guard for 20 years, do you think the absence of light would scare me? No. But one day, I got the scare of my life. About 10 years ago, my wife Jessica died of cancer. It was a terrible time for me and I was quite sad. But what could I do? Jessica was dead and that was that. She was buried in a private cemetery paid for by me. It was one of these idyllic affairs, with gates, a full-time caretaker and all that. It was the most beautiful cemetery you could ever think of. About a year ago, I went visiting Jessica. I had my flowers, I had a small chair to sit in, and I brought a radio and a pack of beer with me. It was the evening, around 6 p.m., and the sun hung low in the sky. I go to my wife's grave, laid down the flowers, and started speaking to her. I spoke about a lot of things, and when it started getting really dark, I noticed that just over a hedge was a man in dark shades. He was staring at me intently, but I continued talking to my wife. People these days, I thought, always staring, never minding their business. At about 8 p.m., the caretaker came to tell me that he'd be leaving by 10. That was my cue to round up my chat with my wife. But I was in the middle of an interesting story, so I continued talking. A few minutes after the guard left me, I heard a scream. It was terrifying, but not one to be cowed, I took my stick and walked over to where the scream came from. It was on the other side of the cemetery, and when I got there, I saw nothing. But then I looked down and saw dark shades, twisted and broken. I picked them up, and as I rose back up, I heard another scream. This time, I was certain it was the caretaker screaming. Night had already descended on the graveyard by now, and I was struggling to see far ahead. A few moments later, I started hearing digging sounds. I made my way back to my wife's grave to take the remainder of what belonged to me and drive off safely. I would call the police on my way out, that's for certain. However, a few yards to my wife's grave, I noticed something extremely disturbing, to put it mildly. The same man I'd seen hours ago was knee-deep in my wife's grave, and the caretaker was tied up beside him. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel his grin as he smiled devilishly at me. "Come on, old man," he said. "Haven't you lived for far too long?" As I turned to flee, I saw him leave the grave and pursue me. Right as I was running for my life, a thunderstorm started. I couldn't see where I was running to, and I kept tripping and falling. I don't know where I got the strength from, but I was able to outrun this madman. By the time I got to the gate, I could no longer see him. I drove right to the police station and reported what I'd seen. By the time I returned with the police, my wife's grave was covered up and we couldn't find the caretaker. It's been a year, and he remains missing.